30 minutes early and stopped it.
All right, it's going.
Okay, good to go. All right. Sounds good. We'll go ahead and get started. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Before we get started here, I have put a couple of publications, a Kentucky publication on home composting and a Virginia backyard composting publication in there in the chat pod. And while you're looking at that in the chat pod, if you'll go in there and type your name in, and whoever's in your house that's watching
Sunday, Monday,
with you,
Saturday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday.
If you'll go in there and actually, put them in there too. So put their names in there too. We'd appreciate it. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen tonight. We're going to be covering composting of the garden, and also we're going to talk about some vermicomposting or composting with worms. Woody Hartlove with Hartlove Farms here in Harlan County. He's done some of that, and so he's going to be sharing that. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and that way we can get started. Glad to have everybody on here tonight. Hopefully with the technology that everything will play nice. All right, there we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. So what is composting? We'll get started on that. It's a decomposition of organic materials, leaves, grass clipping, food waste, that sort of thing. Those are the materials by bacteria, microbes, and other organisms. So you can see there's some strawberries, banana peelings, that sort of things in there. Looks like maybe some peppers, lettuce. So basically just a decomposition of organic materials by bacteria. So you see some of the soil benefits there, and I'm not going to stick with this much, but you can see organic matter tends to stand out there because we definitely want to have some organic material in our soils. Historically, we have lost organic material in all of our gardens over the years, and so we need to try to constantly build that back. So some of the major components of the soils, you can see that 40% is minerals, 25% is pores, which hold water, 25% is pores, which hold air, and then that 10% organic matter. So the big question is why compost? The benefits of organic matter. You've got the benefits of the organic matter. It increases a soil's ability to hold nutrients, improves the soil structure, improves the drainage, reduces erosion, increases the amount of available water for the plants. And so basically you're adding that organic matter in there. If you're familiar with a lot of clay soils, you're adding that in there, that organic matter in there to help bust that clay soil up, that sort of thing. So, so you've got that, but you can see the things that it definitely benefits. Things like the drainage, because if you've got that organic matter in there, it allows the drainage of the water to leach out of the garden and reduces that erosion. If you've got that clay or non-organic matter in your garden, that you have more of a chance of erosion in your soils. And I am having some issues here with my screen, but there we go. All right. So more of why compost: it keeps waste out of landfills that can better be used. 20% of household garbage, such as vegetable scraps and yard waste, go into landfills. We're constantly throwing leftovers in the garbage. So then that is transferred into the landfills. So 20% is a lot. Like I mentioned before, it's beneficial and it can provide free nutrients if done correctly. So that's why we're composting. I thought this was interesting. Total municipal solid waste discarded in 2012, 164 million tons discarded after recycling and composting. So you can see that, things like the wood, the yard trimmings, and the food waste, that comprises of 38%. that can go into a they can go into a land they could go into that's going into the landfill right now. That could actually go into your compost bin. So how does it work? It's a natural process. It's literally alive. It's literally working. Requires food, air, water, and temperature. That's what causes it to work. It's a bacteria. It's a you got the fungus, you got worms, you got the beetles, you got nematodes, all work to break down the waste. So you got to provide the right food. And on the left-hand side, you've got your browns. Those are high in carbon. That's your dried grass, your dried leaves, and your newspaper. And that's a big portion there. That's 25 to 30 parts. You've got your greens. You got things that are high in nitrogen. That's your vegetable and your fruit waste. Also your fresh cut grass. So that's the lesser part. So some of the items you can compost, we can't just compost everything. And so some of the items that you can compost, fruit and vegetable waste, are one, eggshells, coffee grounds and tea bags. You've got your, things like clothes dryer, lint, paper, newspaper, hair, cardboard rolls, cardboard, yard waste such as leaves and grass clippings. You got your straw, hay, and sawdust in small amounts. Make sure your sawdust is in small amounts, because the thing is, sawdust, and a lot of it is hard for it to break down compared to the other waste that you have there. Some of the things that cannot be added to a compost pile: meats products, bones, and fish, fats, grease, and oils. Don't add that. Things like, this stuff is just not going to break down. It's going to sit there. It's going to rot. It's probably going to attract bears and crows and raccoons, you name it. It's going to attract a lot of just wildlife that would feast on that. Things like dairy products such as milk, cheese, yogurts. Do not put those in there. Don't put pet waste and kitty litter in there. Also, one of the things is weeds that are hard to kill and weeds that are going to seed. Don't put that in there, especially if you've got we'll talk about it a little bit in a few minutes. But a cold compost pile, that stuff is just not going to break down. And what's going to happen is when you put that back onto your garden, you've added those weed seeds to that. Also, diseased plants. That's another one. You got diseased tomato plants. I tell people to get those out of their garden. And so the things like diseased plants, don't put those in there because you could harbor the disease and put it right back in there into the garden. Also, black walnut leaves and twigs, yard waste treated with chemicals because you don't want to kill any of the plants that you might have out there. Also, things like coal and charcoal ashes, do not put those in there. So, managing the composting process. The speed of the process and quality of the compost are influenced by food and particle size, mixing, the pile size, the moisture of the pile, the aeration of the pile, and the microorganisms that are in there, and the nutrients. So, some food for compost, like I mentioned earlier. The initial mix must have a proper moisture and air content, as well as organic materials that provide energy for the bacteria. Some examples would be some energy with high moisture. You want some energy products with a high moisture. So grass clippings. When I mean grass clippings, it's like if you cut grass today or cut grass tomorrow, you can put those in there immediately. Say grass that you cut yesterday, you can put those in there immediately. They're green. They still have moisture. Things like fruit and vegetable waste that still have moisture in those, and garden trimmings as well. Bulking agents, that's your lower moisture. Things like wood chips, sawdust, corn stalks. And then you've got your balanced raw materials. Things like ground up tree and shrub trimmings, horse manure, and deciduous leaves. And so that's kind of in the middle there. It's got the moisture and the bulking agent. Those are just some really good examples to have for the initial mix. More raw materials. Energy materials provide the nitrogen and the high energy carbon compounds for fast microbial growth. Those bulking agents, like I mentioned, the limbs and stuff and sawdust, they're porous material. They're going to help aerate that pile. So you can imagine that it's in there. It's holding some space open. It's not as compacted. And so it's going to let the air move through that pile. So it's going to aerate it. They're low in moisture and can break down on their own, though. The balanced raw materials have both the energy and the bulking agent properties. Particle size. The smaller the size, the easier they are to mix and quicker they decompose. And so if you want something that decomposes pretty quick, things like the smaller you get those limbs, the smaller you get apple peelings or whatever you're putting out there, the smaller it is, the quicker they're going to decompose. So grinding, cutting, chopping, however, that's going to reduce the size. Also, make sure you grind those woody branches. Don't pick up just limbs and throw it in there. That stuff's never going to break down. Try to grind it up, try to get it as small as pieces as possible. So mixing the compost. If you've got all the materials on hand, mix them thoroughly throughout the pile. If materials accumulate over time, add new materials. So we're going to talk about hot and cold composting and a little bit about the compost pile size. If you're hot composting, the pile must be big enough to hold the heat. So you want some heat that's held in there. For instance, 1 cubic yard is big enough for a year-round composting. So basically 1 by 1 by 1 is a great for year-round composting. That basically is not just the spring, summer, fall. That's basically get you through the winter as well. So you want to keep that size around 1 cubic yard. Also, small piles are usually colder, and they're going to hold less heat. So the bigger the pile, they're going to hold more heat. They're going to keep that heat in there. They're going to dry out faster. So a little bit about the moisture of the pile. All materials in the pile need to be moist, not soaking wet, but just moist. Make sure that material is moist. You shouldn't be able to squeeze water from it. So if you pick it up and you feel of it and it's got a little bit of moisture to it, and you can't squeeze water from it. Now that may be tough this time of year, what's going on with the weather, but just make sure it's moist. Dry times of year, you may have to add some water. You may have to keep a water bucket around there and just add some water to the pile from time to time, or spray it with a garden hose. So a little bit about providing the right amount of moisture. Compost with the correct amount of moisture, which is about 50 to 60%, should have the consistency of a wrung out damp sponge. Add water if the compost is too dry. So if it starts to dry out, you need to start adding some water. If the compost is too wet, turn it more frequently until air dries that proper moisture to the proper moisture content. So if you get out there, you pick it up, you got a lot of water that's coming out of it, you may need to turn it some. Sorry about that. Screen just froze a little bit here. Just a second. At least I hope it'll. All right, sorry about that. So some air within the compost pile, like we were talking about, microorganisms that decompose the material need oxygen. You got to have that oxygen for them to be able to decompose. So that pile is going to have to needs to be porous enough to pull outside in, pull that outside air in. And this is where those bulking agents mentioned earlier, that sawdust, those limbs, that sort of thing, come into play. So as that pile decomposes, it's going to settle. As you can imagine, it basically is going to decompose. It's going to start settling down. And so that turning that pile is going to help to improve aeration. and it's going to add that air to it. It's going to be able to move it around, and you may even have to add some of those bulking agents. So raw materials used to form the compost pile usually contain all the microorganisms needed. For instance, compost starters are not needed. You just need to add that. In Shatterfield, if you'll watch the waiting room, I see somebody's coming in the waiting room. If you'll watch that, maybe admit them. Adding a few cups of garden soil to a new pile may actually help start the process of the decomposition. So microorganisms. Microorganisms need nutrients to grow and reproduce. These nutrients occur in the raw materials used in the mix, and there's no need to add any additional fertilizers. You know, that's you're producing the fertilizer. You've got the fertilizers there, and as they break things down, it's going to help. So there's no need to add additional fertilizers. So how are we making a compost? No bin is needed unless you want one. And we're going to talk a little bit about bins in a minute, but no bin is needed unless you want one. Piles work just fine. For instance, you got the hot, like I mentioned, versus the cold, which fast and hot method. For instance, the hot produces a high temperature, whereas the cold produces a cooler temperature. The hot or fast takes the least amount of time. The cold takes longer. The hot requires more labor. You're going to be constantly turning it. Also, the cold requires the least amount of effort. The hot is good at killing those weed seeds, like I mentioned earlier, and those pathogens. And the cold or the slow is actually poor at killing weed seeds and pathogens. So you have an issue there that you may end up putting that back into your garden. So here's some cold or slow methods. Composting, all they did is that's three-sided with a bottom on it. That's very simple. Composting can be as hands-off as you want. So here's some of the slow methods. Great for people that don't have a lot of time to tend a hot compost pile. If you work a lot and you need to, you're adding to the compost pile every evening or something like that, you don't have time to work on it, 2 or 3 times a week, this may be good for you. So you're going to mix those non-woody yard waste into a pile, then let them sit for a period of time. Microorganisms, insects, earthworms, and other decomposers will slowly break that pile down. A mixture of energy materials and bulking agents provide the best food source environment for that decomposition. So you want to add both. You want to add some of that material, energy material, and those bulking agents. More on the slow method, you got to add those fresh waste by opening the pile, placing the waste in the center, and covering them. This will help aerate the pile and also buries the fresh waste to pests, so pests won't be attracted to them. Slow composting does not produce the heat needed to kill many of the weed seeds, so it's best to remove any of the weeds and the diseased material as well from the pile. So here we are to the hot and fast method. If you'll notice, we're back to that 25 to 30 parts brown and 1 part green. So this is going to be your faster method. So it create and maintain a balance of air, moisture, and energy for compost microorganisms. This produces a hot pile and breaks down quickly. The heat will kill many weed seed and disease organisms. Also, hot composting takes extra effort, but it produces a quality product quickly. So some steps for building that hot compost pile. Collect enough materials to make it a pile at least 1 cubic yard in volume. Chop, shred, mow, however, the coarse material so they will break down faster. Also start the pile by adding energy material and bulking agent into the mix. Then you're going to squeeze a handful of that mixed material like we talked about earlier. If you can barely squeeze a drop of water, the moisture level's good. If dry, add some water. Too wet, you're going to add some of that drier material. Also, continue adding energy material and bulking agents, mixing and checking the moisture until the pile is built. So you're going to have to turn it. The pile needs to be turned weekly and add water if needed. The turning improves the porosity of the pile. It's going to allow it to aerate and speeds the decay. It also adds outside material to the center of the pile. Just 1 second, this screen is frozen again. So, you're making sure you're turning that compost pile. Like I said, it's going to need to be turned weekly. Then add that water material. That's going to make it for the best of your compost pile. So you're going to cover that pile during the rainy periods. So you imagine right now, my compost pile is going to be covered all the time, and considering as much rain we've got. But so if you got rainy periods, so keeping it just from getting too much moisture, try to cover that up. Also, curing the compost. After the initial mix, a regularly turned pile will stay hot for several weeks. It will shrink to half its volume at the end of this time. So, it's going to start curing pretty quick and breaking down. Allow the pile to sit another 4 to 8 weeks to cure. The compost is ready to use when at least 8 weeks have passed since the initial mixing. So, not long after you start that, you're going to be able to start using that. The pile no longer heats at this time, and the materials look dark and crumbly. So, using the compost, the biggest benefit is to the garden. You're going to be able to use that on your garden. You're going to mix that compost with the soil to add organic material or organic matter, or use it as a mulch. And you can use it either way. I know people that have used it both ways, and it works great. If you've got an area that has a shallow topsoil, this is a great way to add some organic matter to that, like we talked about earlier. Or then if you've got an area that's just, that does really well, that has a good soil, you can use it as a mulch. It's going to be able to keep those weeds controlled because you're using it as mulch. It's going to keep that ground a little cooler as well. Also, a well decomposed earthy compost are good for soil amendments. You can mix 1 to 2 inches of your compost into the soil before you plant a garden, on the lawn, flower bed, or cover crop. So using the compost is a 2% nitrogen, 2% phosphorus, 1% potassium. So it's a fertilizer equivalent of 2-2-1. So basically, if you're going out and you're buying a bag of fertilizer and it says 10-10-10, this here is going to be a 2-2-1. So basically, you're going to get a free fertilizer for a little bit of work. A 1/2 inch to 1 inch layer is sufficient to most flower and vegetable gardens, and it's going to release all of its nutrients slowly over 5 years. That's a good thing because with fertilizer, it's basically gone in a matter of time. So it's going to release those nutrients slowly over a period of time. So talk a little bit about mulching. I mentioned mix 1 to 2 inches of compost in the soil before you plant a garden. Apply in the early summer after the plants are well established and the soil has warmed. So here's some examples, and these are some examples here in Kentucky. You can see they've used some of the pallets for composting bins. They also have one of the tumblers there on the left, and they have a tumbler there on the right, just some different avenues there. Here's one of the plastic barrel tumblers, and you can use just a barrel to make this happen. They make them, that's probably about a 30-gallon there. They make them larger, make them smaller. A trash can would work as well. Here is a compost 3-stage bin at the Fayette County Extension Office here in Kentucky, near Lexington. And if you'll notice, they have 3 stages there. They started with a big stage, and then they're able to take that out. Their cold stage, they're able to continue to add to the stage on the right. Then there's that cold compost bin that I mentioned earlier, and that's just something that's simple. It can you don't have to have the sides on it, but it just keeps everything contained. Tell you what, we'll hold off on questions until a little bit later. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and so if you have any questions, we'll talk later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Woody Hartlove of Hartlove Farms here in Harlan County. And Woody's done some composting. He's done some vermiculture composting. And so, Woody, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can go ahead and share your screen.
All right, let's see if we can get this thing to work. Can you see it?
It is loading. There you go. It is. We can.
Good deal.
Right ahead, Woody.
All right, my name's Woody Hartlove. Like Jeremy said, I own and operate Hartlove Farms here in Harlan County, and I'm going to talk to you all about vermiculture or vermicomposting, or simply called worm composting. Let's see. It's a natural and efficient way to recycle your organic kitchen waste. Worms create worm castings. That is a soil nutrient so rich that gardeners call it garden gold. Worm castings is one of those phrases that was created so that vermicomposting could be discussed in polite society. It's simply just worm poop is all worm castings are. The system contains 4 major elements. It's a physical system, which is the container, the box that you keep the worms in. Biological organisms, which are your worms, your microorganisms, and your macroorganisms. They do all the work. A controlled environment, so you're kind of controlling the temperature, the moisture, acidity, basically just maintaining their home. And then a maintenance program. Bedding preparation, food waste bearing, separating the worms from the compost, and using the compost. To begin with, you need 5 basic ingredients to start vermicomposting. You need a container, you need bedding, you need some water, you need any non-fatty kitchen scraps, and of course worms. The home. Composting worms require a moist, dark, well-drained, and well-aerated environment. You can purchase those, or you can make one of your own. The purchased ones, I've seen them, the small ones run about $50, $60, and I've seen them cost as much as almost $200 for real fancy ones. That's some of the ones that you can buy. You've got round and square, rectangular, and they're pretty fancy. This is mine. This is what I used. It's simply made out of, that's just 2 of them plastic totes from Big Lots, about $5 a piece. Altogether, I've probably got less than $20 for the entire system to make yourself, and they're real easy to make. You can go online and find plenty of videos and instructions on how to make them, and like I said, they're real simple. The shape and the size of it, the container should be shallow, not more than 1.5 feet, 2 foot deep. The worms tend to feed in the top layers of the bedding. If you let the bedding get too thick, the materials may pack down. The size depends on the average pounds of kitchen waste per week. So a box that's 1 foot by 2 foot by 3 foot can handle 6 pounds of kitchen waste in a week, which is average for families from 4 to 6 people. A smaller size box, 1 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, can handle kitchen waste for about 2 people. The container should be made out of wood or plastic. Plastic totes make really good bins. Homemade wooden boxes and buckets, even trash cans will work. The thing with the trash cans, you don't want that, like I said, you don't want that compost material to get too deep in there, so you got to keep an eye on it. Never use a recycled container that might have been used for chemicals. That's not good for the worms or the system. Treated wood could be harmful. I would recommend using just like a plastic tote if you're going to make one yourself. They work really, really good. The bedding must be able to retain both moisture and air while providing a place for the worms to live. Bedding does not have to be purchased, and most of us have plenty of bedding resources in our home, office, or school. Some of the good materials, corrugated cardboard works real good, shredded newspapers, peat moss, decaying leaves. With the shredded newspapers, you want to stay away from like the colored, glossy colored sales ad and stuff. That's not real good to use. Just your regular shredded newspapers. That's what I used. It works really great. With the leaves, if you use hardwood leaves, make sure you crunch them up really, really good, because I put a bunch in there in mine one time, and it was about a year later. I still had plenty of leaves in there from it piled up in there, and they didn't break down so good. Water, rainwater is preferred, or you can use distilled water. If you use tap water, just let it sit for about 24 hours to get that chlorine out. Chlorine's not good for the worms. And you only want to use enough water to keep the bedding moist. You don't want it soaking wet. So if you squeeze the bedding, you should get just a few drops out of it when it's properly moist. The worms, the composting worms, they're also called red wigglers or red worms, are the best for the worm composting. They thrive real good in these bins, and they digest organic material quickly, and they reproduce pretty quick too themselves. They'll multiply real fast. They actually prefer to live in the compost rather than in the soil. Your earthworms and night crawlers and common garden worms won't work. They are soil dwelling and create burrows in the soil. They're best used in the gardens because they aerate the soil, so that your composting worms, they're the ones that eat the food and digest it and do all the compost. Your earthworms and stuff, they aerate the soil, so they don't do very good on your composting. The amount of worms needed will depend on the amount of kitchen waste generated per day. 1 pound of red worms will easily take care of a half a pound of garbage. To add the worms to the bin, just simply scatter them over top. The skin of the worm reacts to the light, and they will immediately work their way into the bedding to get away from the light. When you're setting up your new system, you add your materials and build it up. Let it sit for about 7 to 14 days before adding the worms to it. That allows the microbes to start working, and the worms will have food readily available when you add them to it. So you probably construct your system, get it all prepped and ready to go, and then wait about a week and a half, and then order your worms. And when they come in, you can add them directly to it, and they'll be the system will be ready to go. The best place I found to get them is from a company called Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. They're real good customer service, and they have really good prices. That's where I've gotten mine from. Okay, maintaining your worm bin. There are some factors to keep in mind to maintain it and keep it healthy. The location and security, the temperature, feeding, moisture content, population, and harvesting the castings. You want to keep it in a safe place, quiet and out of the direct sunlight. Otherwise, the sun will shine through the plastic, which irritates the worms. Wherever you stow the bin, be sure the temperatures are moderate. Keep the lid on tight. If your bin is outside, lock down the lid with a bungee cord to keep raccoons and skunks and other insect-eating critters out of there at night. Note to make: keeping the lid on the bin keeps out the light and also keeps out flies. However, it holds in a lot of moisture. If you're having trouble keeping the bin dry enough, you could cut a window in the top of the lid and then put a piece of window screen over top of it. That way you get both air and protection. But keep in mind, if you do that, make sure it stays in a shaded place so the light doesn't get in there and bother the worms. Temperature. These worms can tolerate a range of temperatures, but the ideal temperature is between 55 and 77 degrees. Bedding with the temperature above 84 is very harmful, sometimes fatal to the redworm populations. It'll cook them. And temperatures should be measured inside the box because the temperature in the moist bedding is usually lower than the outside air. Just get yourself like a inexpensive thermometer and just keep it inside the box on top of the compost, and that'll give you an idea what the temperature is in there. They should be protected from freezing temperatures. Anything below 50 degrees and the worm's activity starts to slow down. And if they freeze, it'll kill them. That's what happened to mine a couple of years ago. I neglected to bring them inside and keep them warm, and we had a good hard freeze for a few days, and I lost all my worms. Feeding them. Compost works in concert, composting worms work in concert with fungi and bacteria to break down rotten food. If it's not rotting, they're not interested in it. That's why it usually takes a couple of days before they approach new food. Overall, they prefer soft food such as oatmeal, squash, too hard food such as carrots. Of course, even carrots will rot eventually, and the worms will get to them. Don't put large chunks of food in the bin. Make sure you chop it up real good. Small pieces, that'll speed up decomposition. These guys have got little tiny mouths, so they need little bitty pieces to be able to eat. Feeding should be done on a regular basis, but be sure not to overload the system. The amount of food should be about a 2-to-1 ratio for the worms. That's about 2 pounds of worms is needed to take care of 1 pound of food per 24 hours. If too much kitchen waste is produced on certain occasions, you might want to temporarily store it in another container for later use. An overloaded worm box can become anaerobic, which is stinky. If that happens, don't add any fresh kitchen waste for a while. If you leave the system alone, the situation should correct itself. So if it's got a nice earthy smell to it, then it's working correctly and they're doing their job. But if it starts to smell, you're overloading your system, and that'll actually attract a lot of unwanted critters. When you're adding food to the bin, the easiest way to do it is just spread this kitchen layers or the kitchen scraps in a layer on the bedding in like one corner or half of it. If the bin is kept in a dark place or covered, the worms will come to the surface to eat. You can also pull back some of the bedding in the bin and dump the scraps in. Cover the scraps with 1 inch of bedding. Start in one corner and work your way around the whole box. By the time you get back to where you started at, everything should be pretty much eaten. These guys, they work pretty quick. The kind of things you can feed them: coffee grounds and tea leaves are real good for them. Crushed eggshells. If you're going to give them eggshells, make sure you pulverize them so it's almost powder-like so they can digest it real good. Dry cornmeal is good, but just use a little bit and you can use it as a treat for them. Fruits of all sorts except for citrus. Lettuce, they really go for the lettuce. And the ones I had, they ate up lettuce like it was steaks. Oatmeal and other cooked grains. Squash is good. Some wet breads and bready things like cooked pasta, but you want to make sure there's no sauces or or grease or anything like that in your pastas and breads when you give it to them. That's not good for them. Just about any chopped vegetable matter, fresh or cooked. With the cooked vegetables, you want to make sure that, there's no fats or dairy products or sauces or anything like that in it, stuff that they won't eat. Newspaper and uncoated cardboard is real good, and even rabbit droppings is good for them. What you don't want to feed them, you don't want to feed them citrus. It's antimicrobial, and the acidity in the citrus fruit isn't good for the worms. You don't want to give them any kind of dairy. Small traces are okay, but you don't want to put a whole lot in there, maybe just a very little bit. No meats, no oils, no salty or processed foods. Don't give them any sugars. Small traces are okay, but no large amounts. No vinegar. Stay away from the fresh cow, horse, and especially chicken manure. All this will burn the worms. Very harmful to them. And fresh cut corn. I learned the hard way about fresh cut corn. I had thrown some chopped up corn cobs in mine, and I got some kind of bug in there, and it took me almost 2 months to finally get rid of that bug. It didn't really hurt the system any, but they were just all over everything. Moisture content. Your bedding needs to remain moist but not wet. A few drops of moisture released by squeezing would be a good guideline for the right amount. If 5 or more drops are produced, the material is too wet. To dry it out, try adding some dry shredded newspaper. This will soak up any extra moisture and provide more bedding for the worms. If it's drying out, mist the paper with water from a spray bottle and dampen the bedding again. What I used and found real good was a burlap sack. Pick them up at like Tractor Supply for $1. I'd get it, I'd soak it and then wring it out real good so it's just damp, and then lay that on top of the entire system. And that kept the moisture in pretty good and a good control of it. Population control. You don't want your worms to be overcrowded. They'll have to compete for food if there's too many of them. If your worms have to compete for food, the population will go down. If there's a lot of food available for a time, then the worms multiply at a high rate and more young worms come in, and then there's more to compete, and they will compete with their parents. To solve the problem, you can feed them more food, but the best result is to simply split the system. It's kind of like, if you know anything about beekeeping, it's like splitting the hives. It's the same little process. You'll prepare another whole box, set it in on top of what you've got already, and give them about 2 weeks, a week and a half to 2 weeks, and part of them will migrate up into that new box, and then you can just pull it out and put it in have a whole nother system going on for you. The castings, which is what you're really after, harvesting those. You want to do that every once in a while. You remove it from time to time. Wind depends on the bedding used, the quantity of the worms in the box, the temperature, and the moisture conditions. Usually 4 to 6 months is a good guess for keeping the same bedding if the worm boxes are correctly maintained. The deeper the contents of the bin, the greater danger of the bottom portion of the bin turning swampy and anaerobic. To prevent that, don't let the contents of the bin get too deep. Keep the depth of the contents between 6 to 8 inches, and you should be fine. It's important to note that castings are toxic to their own species, so it's advisable to harvest the castings regularly. There's a couple ways of harvesting. One is to simply sift through the castings, separating the worms and the large pieces from the castings. Another way is to prepare a new bin for the worms and set it on top of the castings and wait for a few weeks for the worms to migrate up into the new bin, then shift the castings. That's not like splitting. Splitting only takes about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. When you're going to harvest these castings, set that box, that new container on top, and wait about a month. That way, that ensures that pretty much almost all the worms get up into the new home, and then you can harvest the castings in the old one. Sifting through the castings, you want to separate the castings from the usable material, from the non-usable material. You can make a sifter. Simple sifter can be made from some scrap wood and some 1/4-inch mesh. The size will depend on how much castings you do at one time. If you just got a little small box, just a small little sifter works just fine. Be gentle when sifting, prevent harming any worms that may be left in the castings. You can put those back in the box. For finer material, build a square a second shifter using 1/8-inch mesh. There's many designs out there. You can get on the internet and look at all kinds of designs. They can be as simple as just a square box with mesh on it, and some of them are pretty elaborate with the tumblers that you see there in those pictures. And then after you sift through the castings, you can use those castings, either add it to the soil or add it to your potting mix, or you can use it to make worm tea. And that's what we'll talk about next. This is the good stuff, the worm tea. Worm tea is produced when worm castings are mixed with water and molasses and brewed for about 24 hours. The molasses will serve as a food source for beneficial microorganisms that are part of the worm castings. The brewing process multiplies the beneficial microorganisms of the worm castings tea rapidly. The finished product will achieve the best results if used within 24 hours after the end of brewing process, but will still be beneficial for 7 months. So you want to get the best use out of it, use it within 24 hours. Note that if you do bottle it, just shake it before you use it to activate the remaining microorganisms. When you're making the worm tea, the castings don't have to be sifted. You can take it right out of the box and use it for your brew. Brewing it's pretty simple. That's the list of what you need: just a 5-gallon bucket, an aquarium pump, the airline tubings, the stones, some weights. The weights, all that weight does is that goes where your filter stones are at, just to hold them underwater. Some kind of a fine mesh pouch, a nylon stocking works real good. Some kind of clamp to hold your tea bag in place, and then of course the water, and then about 1.5 to 1 3 cups of fresh worm castings, 1 tablespoon of liquid unsulfured molasses, and then a bottle of hydrogen peroxide to clean everything after you're done. It's real simple to do it. You pretty much just fill up your 5-gallon bucket full of water. Try to use rainwater or pond water. Tap water has chlorine, and it'll kill all the microbes in it. Stay away from any form of treated water, even bottled water. If you're gonna have to use tap water, you can run the bubbler for about 4 hours without any castings in it, and that should get rid of the chlorine and stuff, or just let it sit out in the sun for a day or two to burn off that chlorine. You put the worm castings in the nylon stocking or the pouch, whatever you're using, and then clamp it to the side of the bucket. Connect all your air lines and the stone, excuse me, and the stones to hold them all underwater. And then turn on the system and slowly add your molasses to it. The molasses is a catalyst to grow the microbes. It serves as a food source for them. Then you just let it brew for about 24 to 48 hours. After you're done, just clean it all with the hydrogen peroxide. The unwanted microbes will grow as it is wet and taking time to dry it out. So it's a pretty simple thing, and then just use it. Using the worm tea, you spray it or shower your plants with it. You can use it straight. You don't need to dilute it. Be sure to get under your leaves as well. The bigger the drops are, the longer it will soak into the plant if using as a foliar spray. It can be added directly to the soil around the plants. If you dilute the tea, it'll make it last a little longer. A ratio of 5 parts of water to 1 part tea can still bring great results. The water is only a carrier. The 5 gallons will treat approximately 1 acre of soil. Mix the tea with 50 gallons of untreated water to apply. You cannot put too much on. Remember, it's just healthy, living microorganisms. So you're not going to hurt anything if you add too much. And, you know, like it says, it'll go a long ways. Some notes. When making worm tea, you don't have to suspend the castings in a bag. You can brew them directly in the water. It's just if you're going to use it as a foliar spray, make sure that you filter those castings out so it doesn't clog your spray nozzles. You can put the worm castings back in the bin when you're done. They're fully Arabic microbes, and possibly some worms and cocoons might be in there also. So you just throw it right back in the box. Remember, if you plan on using a sprayer, make sure you strain the castings out of the liquid so that you don't clog your sprayer nozzles. If you notice, the bottom box on there has got a little valve on it. On the cartoon, it's got a valve. Most of them will have it. That's more or less just like a catch container. It just catches the liquid that comes out of the compost itself, which is called leachate. Some people mistakenly call it worm tea. Worm tea is produced, like we talked about, when the castings are mixed with water and molasses and brewed for at least 24 hours. The leachate is the liquid runoff or seepage that settles in or below the vermicomposting of worm castings. Like it says, one is seeping and the other is steeping. Some leachate can be harmful or can contain harmful pathogens because it has not been processed through the worm's intestinal tracts. During decomposition, waste releases liquid from its cells structure. As it breaks down, this liquid or leachate seeps down through the worm composter into a collection area. The leachate should be drained regularly, and if you're getting more than 2 to 4 ounces of liquid in a week, the worm composter is probably too wet. So you're not going to get a whole lot in there if your system's balanced right. You'll get a little bit, and you want to drain it out every so often just to make sure it doesn't build up in there, because it could be harmful to the worms and start to smell and everything. While leachate can have a value as a liquid fertilizer, it should be treated with caution. For every story extolling the benefits of using leachate, there's one laminating the problems from having used it. You go looking that up online and you'll get conflicting stories. Some people say that you can use it, and other people say to stay away from it and just dump it out. If you do use it, it's recommended that you use it on like your ornamental garden plants, your flowers and stuff, and not on anything that's edible. Don't use it if it smells bad. It should smell like earth when it comes out of the worm composter. If it does smell bad, just pour it out on an area where it cannot be harmful to any plants or animals. Dilute it to 10 parts water to 1 part leachate. If you do use it, that's about a 3/4 cup of leachate to 1 gallon of water. Aerate it with an air pump if available. You don't have to, but it's a good idea too. And only use it outdoors on shrubs, ornamentals, and flowering plants only. apply to soil around base of the plant. Do not use on plants if you intend to eat them. So any of your vegetables and things like that, don't use it on that. It's not a good idea to. But you can, but there's some real precautions you need to take if you do decide to. Don't use it on any leafy greens or lettuce. Only apply it to the soil around the base and just a little bit. Use it in the early growing stages of vegetables, like after you've transplanted or when after they've been up for a while. Do not apply when they're producing fruits, and wait a few weeks before harvesting after you apply it. That's all I've got. It's a fun and easy little project, something that the whole family can do, and pretty fun for the kids. And there. Okay, Jeremy, I think you got it now.
Awesome. Thanks, Woody. Good information. Good information. Does anybody have any questions for myself or Woody? I am going to go ahead and post a publication from North Carolina State University on vermicompost.
You're muted or something.
I muted and then unmuted, evidently. Unmuted, then muted. So I posted some information on vermicompost in the chat pod, and I also have posted a couple links from Kentucky and Virginia on home and backyard composting. So you should be able to click on those, and they'll pop right up on your web browser. But do we have any questions for Woody or myself? Andy asked, "Is there a time frame, or how do you know when to split your worms, Woody?"
You just want to kind of keep an eye on them, like the population. It just kind of sift through them a little bit. If it looks like they're getting overpopulated, then split it. There's no real set time limit because a lot of that depends on how much they're eating and things like that. But they do multiply pretty quick, so you want to make sure you keep a pretty decent eye on. Probably, I'd say probably about every 4 or 5 months, maybe 6.
Good deal. Good question. Okay. You mentioned 1 cubic yard would be a year of composting. What size will be ready in 8 weeks? And so you're going to start with that one by one, that 1 cubic yard. And so it just depends on how much it breaks down. If in warmer weather, it may tend to break down a little quicker. So you're going to have a little bit more. It just depends on when you start your compost pile, is how much is going to be ready in 8 weeks. When you start to get to that, like I mentioned, when it starts to get to that darker colored, that's when you start using it. And so it just depends on the time of year, and how warm it is, and how much energy that it has in it. For instance, a hot pile is going to break down a whole lot quicker than a cold pile. Good question. Anything else? Thank you for the thumbs up, Merle. Well, I want to, if there's no other questions, I want to thank Woody for coming in and talking about vermiculture, so vermicompost, and thank you all for joining in. Good to see everybody here tonight. We missed you last night. Andy has one more. Can you feed the worms too much coffee grounds? That's a good question. I'm thinking you don't want to over-carbonate them. What's your thoughts on that, Woody?
Not really. They go through those coffee grounds pretty quick. They seem to really like them. I wouldn't go like dumping tons of it in there. But it's just like everything else. You can see it. Just like when you're feeding them the regular food, just keep an eye on it, and you'll know when it's too much because they'll stop eating it or slow down.
Good stuff. Thank you, sir. Well, if that's all the questions, we thank you for tuning in tonight, and we've got another great presentation tomorrow night. We'll be talking about drip irrigation of in your garden. We've got Bonnie Sigmund from the Laurel County, Kentucky Extension Office. She's the horde agent over there, and she's well versed in that. She grows a lot of vegetables on her family farm, and so should be another great program tomorrow night. But thank you all for tuning in. And Shadfield, do y'all have anything to add?
I've been resisting the urge to ask Woody the question of, I thought you were supposed to try to keep your kids from getting worms, but I decided it would be in bad taste, so I didn't do it.
These are good worms, though.
Good job.
All right. Good job, Woody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you all tomorrow night about 6 o'clock.
Okay. You too.
You guys.
Thanks.